The answer to whether salt is good for you or not is today's topic. I'm Dr. Eric and I'm a hormone, diabetes, and blood pressure specialist, in short, endocrinologist. Were you told by your doctor on YouTube or Google that you should eat as much salt as you want? Is that true? Is that true for everyone? I'll tell you one thing. They don't tell the entire story. They just want to throw flashy titles to attract attention. For example, they will talk about salt's effect on blood pressure, but they don't say anything about how salt affects the risk of kidney stones, etc. Today, we will dive deep into all the studies and understand the true meaning and results of cutting salt and individual variability in cutting back on the salt. Also, we will talk about who will respond with lower blood pressure or not by cutting back on the salt, and how this will affect your blood pressure medications. I generally have a problem with doctors making blanket statements and talking like one diet will fit everyone for diabetes or blood pressure, etc. That is wrong. People are different. Everyone responds to food and lifestyle changes differently. I will tell you how you can determine, you personally, by lowering your salt in your diet, whether it will help you personally to lower your blood pressure, and we will talk about some other risks of high salt today as well. When I work with diabetes and high blood pressure, I focus on hormonal problems because they are all at the root cause of these problems too. So some YouTube doctors, for example, who have not been trained in endocrinology, they will make blanket claims, which irritates me because half of what they say is not true, and it will not apply to everyone. There's a lot of debate about how salt and the blood pressure is linked. That's true. But there's no more time for that. Today, I will get to the point, and you probably know me. I shoot straight, and I don't have time to be political. I'm a scientist, and I look at the data as a whole, not just to cherry-pick studies and present to mislead people. It is so easy to mislead and deceive lay people because they don't know any better. No more of that, especially on my channel. I watched a few YouTube videos. They said that salt is all good for you and you can eat as much as salt you want. I was shocked. A lot of people who have high blood pressure could be hurt by this. This is not only irresponsible, but it can also be dangerous. They say that because they think that their people are on keto and stuff. Yes, on keto diet and intermittent fasting, you are going to be more lenient. You may lose more electrolytes and stuff like that. You may be more lenient with salt and get away with extra salt in your diet a little bit better. But how many people are on keto diet consistently, and how many people practice intermittent fasting consistently? We already know that insulin resistance could cause high blood pressure through compensatory hyperinsulinemia or high insulin, right? And we know insulin has been shown to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system that makes the kidney retain more sodium and change how sodium moves throughout your body and make vascular smooth muscle grow bigger, causing high blood pressure, etc. But that's not the point here. Here is the deal. The response of the blood pressure to changes in salt intake is not the same for everyone. Okay, so yes, if your insulin goes down, insulin resistance goes down, your blood pressure will go down. But salt sensitivity is real. We call this salt sensitivity, which is a term that has been used to describe this. And why? Because those people who have the biggest rise in their blood pressure when they eat more salt and the biggest drop when they eat less salt, we call them salt sensitive people. People who have little or no change in their blood pressure when they eat more salt, we call them salt resistant. So there is no widely agreed upon threshold for salt sensitivity. So you have to give it a try. Go for a very low salt diet for 2 weeks and keep an eye on your blood pressure during this time. If your systolic blood pressure drops 5 or more points, then your blood pressure is salt sensitive. If you don't see that much difference, at least, then you're salt resistant. Don't worry about eating less salt then, if that's the case. But you have to try. Just like measuring your blood sugar, right? It is that easy. But before you try, you may want to know your chances of being salt sensitive or not. I mean, what are the chances that you will be salt sensitive? Well, here's how you can find out. Now, before we move further, if you're enjoying this video so far or learning something, please like, subscribe, and write a comment below. Just follow the community guidelines. Also, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, where we provide a lot of short and sweet videos that are easier to digest. Back to the topic. Now, salt sensitivity can be affected by your gender, your age, your diabetes status, your weight status, your genetics, and more. Let's talk more about this. How do you know that you can be salt sensitive? People's blood pressure may rise and fall differently when they eat more salt, right? This could be because of biological differences between people, and sometimes simply it could be from, that they're not measuring their blood pressure right and so forth. So it may be hard to determine for you. But many studies, mostly done on rodents and rats, show that true biological differences are playing a key role here. Most of the genetic problems that have been found in salt-sensitive hypertensive rats, for example, it has to do with how kidney salt excretion is controlled. Indeed, most mechanistic studies have linked the salt sensitivity to actually subclinical kidney problems, which most diabetics have, especially how the kidneys deal with sodium excretion and so forth. There are new ways of looking at genetics as well, and uncovering new ways of looking at things by determining people's genetic profile. Now, what else? There are some human studies that say, for example, your age, your gender and race and ethnicity, even your weight, and whether you have high blood pressure, whether you have diabetes, underlying kidney disease, might affect how your blood pressure changes when you eat salt. For example, there is this big study, you may have heard about it, DASH trial, and it's one of the biggest trials that looked at the effects of salt on everyone, regardless of their race or age. They also looked at the effects of salt on people with different baseline blood pressure. A strong and consistent body of evidence has shown this. The general conclusion was that if you cut back on sodium, your blood pressure will go down more than if you don't cut back on the sodium at all. But like I said, individual people will vary in terms of their results. People who ate less salt in their DASH diet also, typically saw a blood pressure drop of 8 in African Americans and 5 in white Americans. If you're African American, it is more likely for you to respond to low salt diet than a Caucasian. And people who are truly hypertensive, like the blood pressure in the 150, 160, 170 range, they'll see a bigger drop in their blood pressure when they cut back on sodium. If your blood pressure is just 130, 140, you may not see a big difference. But if you're salt sensitive and cut back on sodium with a very high blood pressure, you will see a bigger difference. What else did they find? They also found that older people have a bigger drop in their blood pressure than the younger people if they cut back on the salt. So let's say you're in your 70s or 80s, you're more likely to respond to cutting back than somebody in their 30s or 40s. That also depends on how much potassium intake you have. In DASH diet, for example, includes a lot of vegetables and fruits, which can also help, lowering the blood pressure. So if you're eating more vegetables and fruits and you're adding more potassium to your diet, will help you in cutting your blood pressure while you're cutting your salt. Also, interesting, there is some evidence that the women are more likely to be salt sensitive than men, and then overweight people are more likely to be salt sensitive than normal weight people. Now, few studies have looked at the effects of cutting back on salt on blood pressure in Asian people and people with diabetes or chronic kidney disease. But we believe there's more likely for these people to respond to cutting back on the salt. Now, how about what happens when you cut back on the salt? What kind of effect do you see on your medication? In addition to lowering the blood pressure, cutting back on sodium intake can actually make your antihypertensive medications work better. And for most people, except for calcium channel blockers like amlodipine and stuff, for most medications, they will work better. Following treatment with a diuretic such as hydrochlorothiazide, if you are on a low sodium diet, that actually reduces the risk of potassium loss. As you know, a lot of you are on diuretics like hydrochlorothiazide and you end up taking potassium, but if you cut back on salt, you will not need to take as much potassium. Because when you're on a high salt diet, you're actually losing more potassium in your urine. Cutting back on the salt makes the blood pressure more dependent on angiotensin II enzyme because of the reduction in the sodium in diet. Now, when you're on ACE inhibitor like a lisinopril or any medication that ends with the pril, or angiotensin II receptor blockers like the losartan, or any medication that ends with artin, it will be more effective when you cut back on the salt. People who are African American may be more sensitive to cutting back, like we discussed, and people who are taking like diuretic again, people taking like hydrochlorothiazide or ACE inhibitors like lisinopril, losartan will definitely respond so much better to cutting back on salt. If you're already trying to control your blood pressure, that will be much more effective for you. So what if you have kidney disease? Well, if you have proteinuria, which is protein leak in your kidneys, which is commonly seen in diabetics, and we use medications like lisinopril or losartan for that, cutting back on sodium actually significantly lowers the not only blood pressure but the protein leak in your kidneys. That's definitely, if you cut back on the salt, we see the results much better on reduction in your protein in your urine. People who eat a lot of salt don't seem to have an effect on how much the calcium channel blocker control their blood pressure like we discussed, but most other blood pressure medications will work better. Now, next question is, does cutting back on sodium help prevent heart attacks or strokes? Well, in theory, cutting back on sodium should cut down on the heart disease because it lowers the blood pressure and prevents high blood pressure, right? Overall, the best available evidence strongly suggests that people should cut back on their sodium intake to help prevent heart disease and stroke. Several studies have looked at public health benefits and costs of cutting back on salt. They found that cutting back on salt can help people with high blood pressure overall. In one study, cutting back on salt intake by 3 grams a day was estimated to save almost 200 to 400,000 lives per year and cutting the healthcare costs by a lot. A few studies have looked directly at how cutting back on sodium affects the cardiovascular health, but over 5 years, those who took part in the largest of these studies who ate less salt were less likely to have stroke and they were less likely to die. They replaced the table salt actually with potassium-enriched salt substitute that was 75% sodium chloride and 25% potassium chloride, and the relative risk of cardiovascular events were cut by up to 30%. Other things that can go wrong when you have too much sodium in your body, well, and they're bad. People who eat too much sodium, they will have other problems, not just a high blood pressure. So there's a lot of evidence for that. One clinical study shows that, for example, people who eat more salt have bigger left ventricular mass in their heart. Other studies have shown that cutting back on sodium improves the structure and function of your arteries. In addition, too much sodium may actually raise the risk of stomach cancer, protein leak in the kidneys, kidney stones, and bone fractures, osteoporosis. The last two disorders show that sodium intake actually and calcium excretion is linked. As sodium intake increases, so does your calcium excretion from your kidneys. Also, in 2 studies, it was shown that people who eat a lot of salt, they were more likely to get headaches. Some evidence has linked high sodium intake to changes in the immune system as well, and autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis. There is no evidence that a low sodium intake is a public health problem at all. So if you're eating very little salt, nothing wrong with that. There are some people who think it is, even though cutting your sodium intake to nothing might make your insulin resistance and blood lipids a little worse. But if you're cutting back on the sodium in a moderate way, you will be perfectly fine. Potential side effects of cutting back on sodium could be increase in the uric acid and plasma renin activity. However, the clinical significance of small increases in uric acid and renin angiotensin, etc., as a result of cutting back on the sodium is not clear at all. In fact, the thiazide diuretics like hydrochlorothiazide, which actually raise your uric acid and plasma renin activity level, but they are the ones that are also cutting back on your risk of heart attack quite a bit. So, you figure. So I hope that answered a lot of questions about how salt intake and how it affects your overall health. That concludes my video. I hope you learned something today. And if you did, please subscribe, pass this video to someone you may think may benefit from it. So, thank you very much. I'll see you in the next video. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying this channel so far, and I hope you subscribed already. If you didn't, do it. And if you did, watch this video right there. I think that will help.